October 18th, 1942. Late night. The command post of the Panzer Army Africa, near El Alamein. The desert wind hissed against the canvas of the command tent, driving sand into every seam and crevice. Inside, under the wavering light of an oil lamp, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood motionless before his desk. In his hand, he held not a tactical map, nor a report on the fuel shortages choking the Afrika Korps, but a single telegram. A thin piece of paper, yet it carried a weight heavier than an entire tank division. The message was stamped Geheim Kommandosache Top Secret. The sender, Adolf Hitler. Its contents were brief, cold, and devastating. History would come to know it as the Commando Order. The directive was explicit. All Allied commandos, whether armed or unarmed, whether in uniform or camouflaged, if captured during raids, were to be slaughtered to the last man. Even if they raised their hands in surrender, they were to be denied the status of prisoners of war. They were to be executed on the spot. Rommel read the words again and again. His fingers, accustomed to directing bold armored thrusts, now whitened as they gripped the edge of the page. 30 years of military service had forged Rommel into a professional soldier. He fought for Germany. He fought for the Führer. He understood the brutality of war. He knew the damage the British SAS had inflicted on his supply lines. But this order violated every code of honor he had sworn to uphold. In Rommel's mind, a battle raged, more violent than the artillery duels echoing outside. On one side stood his oath of loyalty, a sacred vow every German officer had sworn to Hitler personally. To refuse a direct order from the Führer in wartime was treason. The penalty was death not just for him, but potentially for his family. On the other side stood his conscience. Rommel's motto had always been Krieg ohne Hass, war without hate. He had burned letters, threatening prisoners before. He had shared water with captured British soldiers. If he signed this order, he would cease to be a field marshal. He would become an executioner. Colonel Westphal, his chief of staff, stood in the shadows, waiting. The silence in the tent was heavy, broken only by the screaming wind. Rommel looked down at Hitler's signature at the bottom of the page, a signature that had spread terror across Europe. Now, it was asking Rommel to sell his soul. He picked up his pen. The black ink glistened in the dim light. If he passed this order down the chain of command, hundreds, perhaps thousands of British and American soldiers would be murdered. Their blood would stain his hands forever. But if he refused, Rommel took a deep breath, the smell of desert dust and machine oil filling his lungs. He looked at Westphal, then back at the paper. In that moment, the Desert Fox was not calculating tank maneuvers or artillery coordinates. He was calculating the price of honor. And what he decided to do in the next 10 seconds would be one of the most courageous and dangerous acts of his military life. An act that Berlin would never forgive if they ever found out the truth. He did not sign. Instead, Rommel's hand moved with a sudden, sharp deliberation, bypassing the inkwell entirely. He grasped the top corner of the telegram, the paper that carried the Führer's direct command, and held it over the glass chimney of the oil lamp. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the dry paper curled, browned, and burst into a small, orange flame. In the cramped silence of the command tent, the only sound was the faint crackle of burning paper. Colonel Westphal watched, his eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. He was witnessing an act of high treason committed by Germany's most celebrated general. The fire consumed the words "execute" and "no mercy," turning the supreme leader's directive into nothing more than black ash that drifted down onto the tactical maps spread across the desk. Rommel dropped the last burning fragment onto the dirt floor and crushed it under the heel of his boot. The message was gone, physically, at least. But the act of destroying it had forged a new, dangerous reality. By burning the commando order, Rommel had not just disobeyed, he had actively conspired to keep his subordinates innocent. If the order did not exist in the files, his officers could not be compelled to carry it out. He was placing himself as a human shield between the brutality of Berlin and the conscience of the Afrika Korps. He looked up at Westphal, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the lamp. "No silent killings in my rear areas," he said, his voice low but hard as steel. "Here, we fight soldiers, not murderers." It was a sentence that defined his war, but it was also a sentence that marked him. In the eyes of the Nazi hierarchy, mercy was weakness. and independence was a threat. The secret now hung heavy in the air between the two men. They both knew the Gestapo had ears everywhere in the mess halls, in the radio trucks, perhaps even in this very headquarters. If word reached Berlin that Rommel had burned a direct order from Hitler, the Desert Fox would be hunted by his own side. But the immediate danger was not political, it was tactical. The British Eighth Army was massing for an offensive, and inevitably, amidst the chaos of the coming battles, Allied commandos would be captured. The test of Rommel's defiance would not be in the burning of the paper, but in what happened when the first British prisoner was dragged before him, waiting to see if the German legend lived up to his reputation, or if he would follow the dark path his Führer had laid out. The test of Rommel's defiance arrived not as a theoretical debate, but in the back of a dusty half-track truck. Just days later, a German patrol returned from the deep desert, dragging with them a prize that should have been a death sentence. They had captured a small team of British commandos, men of the SAS, or the Long-Range Desert Group. These were the very men Hitler's order was designed to eradicate. They did not look like regular soldiers. They were bearded, sun-scorched, their uniforms a patchwork of non-regulation kit adapted for survival in the deep sands. To the high command in Berlin, these men were terrorists and saboteurs, unworthy of the rules of war. Under the commando order, they were walking corpses, their lives forfeited the moment they were taken alive. As they were shoved out of the truck, stumbling into the blinding sunlight of the German camp, the air grew thick with tension. A junior officer, a captain perhaps too eager to prove his ideological purity, looked from the prisoners to the field marshal. The captain knew the rumors. Whispers of the new directive had trickled down through the SS channels and the political officers. He expected a firing squad. He expected a shallow grave in the dunes. His hand rested on his holster, waiting for the signal to initiate the butchery that the Führer demanded. "Instructions, Herr General?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Rommel stepped forward. He walked slowly down the line of captured Britons. He looked them in the eye. He did not see criminals. He saw men who had fought with skill and audacity, men who had endured the same heat, the same thirst, and the same fear as his own troops. He saw fellow warriors. The silence stretched, agonizingly long. The British prisoners stood rigid, bracing themselves. They knew the reputation of the Nazi regime. They likely assumed these were their final moments on Earth. Rommel stopped in front of the British leader. He didn't scream. He didn't lecture. He simply turned to his expectant captain and spoke with a casual, dismissive authority. "Process them," he said. "Standard prisoner of war protocol. Rations, water, medical checks, then move them to the rear." The captain blinked, confused. "But sir, their status, the irregular uniforms." "They are soldiers," Rommel cut him off, his voice dropping a temperature, "and they will be treated as soldiers." "Do I need to repeat myself?" The captain snapped his heels together and saluted, though his eyes betrayed his shock. As Rommel turned his back and walked away toward his command vehicle, he didn't look back at the prisoners. He didn't need their gratitude. But by sparing them, he had done something far more dangerous than losing a battle. He had created living witnesses to his treason. Every breath those British soldiers took was now a direct defiance of Adolf Hitler. And in the paranoid court of the Third Reich, witnesses were the most dangerous thing a general could have. The mercy shown to the British prisoners was a flicker of humanity in a world that was rapidly catching fire. But kindness could not stop a tank shell, and honor could not refuel an empty gas tank. Within days of Rommel's quiet act of defiance, the sky above El Alamein turned into a sheet of flame. General Montgomery had launched his masterstroke. The British artillery barrage was so intense it was said to shake the fillings in the teeth of men miles away. The Afrika Korps, outnumbered and outgunned, began to disintegrate under the hammer blow. Rommel sat in his command vehicle, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, watching his life's work burn on the horizon. The tactical situation was crystal clear. Stand and die, or retreat and survive to fight another day. As a field commander, the choice was obvious. He prepared the orders for a strategic withdrawal, a maneuver that would save the lives of tens of thousands of his veteran soldiers. But just as the engines were revving up, the radio operator handed him another message from Berlin. It was not a commando order this time. It was something far more sweeping and far more insane. Adolf Hitler, sitting in a bunker thousands of miles away, detached from the blood and the grit of the desert, had commanded, "Yield not a yard of ground. You can show your troops no other road than that, to victory or death." Rommel stared at the message. It was the commando order all over again, but writ large. The first order had demanded he murder the enemy. This order demanded he murder his own men. The pattern was undeniable. To the Führer, human lives, whether British or German, were nothing but currency to be spent in service of an ego. The victory or death order broke something inside Rommel that the commando order had only cracked. It was the moment the Desert Fox realized he was fighting two enemies, the British in front of him and the madness behind him. For 24 hours, Rommel hesitated. The weight of his oath paralyzed him. In that hesitation, entire battalions were overrun. Men were crushed under tank treads because their commander was shackled to the will of a dictator. But as the casualty reports piled up on his desk, a mountain of dead German boys, the memory of the burned telegram returned to him. He had defied Hitler to save British commandos. Why couldn't he defy him to save his own countrymen? The spell broke. Rommel slammed his fist onto the map table. "We are retreating," he barked, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. He openly countermanded the Führer's direct instruction. He ordered the withdrawal. The Afrika Korps began to pull back, escaping the British trap by the skin of their teeth. He had saved his army, just as he had saved the prisoners. But in doing so, he had committed his second strike. Berlin was watching, and in the dark corridors of power, the dossier on Erwin Rommel was growing thicker, filling with evidence of a general who thought his conscience was higher than the party. The retreat from El Alamein was not just a movement of men and machines. It was a race against the vengeful hand of Berlin. While General Montgomery's tanks nipped at the heels of the Afrika Korps, Rommel was acutely aware that the more dangerous threat came from the wireless messages in his rear. Every mile he moved back was a mile of open defiance against the Führer's victory or death decree. In the eyes of the high command, Rommel was no longer just a struggling general. He was a traitor who had valued the lives of his soldiers over the fanatical ideology of the Reich. As the German columns snaked westward across the blistering sands of Libya, Rommel's health began to fail. The crushing weight of double warfare fighting the British and resisting Hitler had manifested in his body. He suffered from severe exhaustion, fainting spells, and stomach ailments. His face, once the picture of vibrant energy in propaganda reels, was now gaunt and etched with the deep lines of a man who saw the end approaching. Yet, even in his physical decline, he remained a ghost in the desert, personally flying his Storch spotter plane over the retreating lines, ensuring that not a single unit was left behind to be slaughtered. Back in Germany, the propaganda machine was still painting him as the invincible hero, but behind the closed doors of the Wolf's Lair, the tone was changing. Hitler's inner circle, led by the fanatical Martin Bormann and the suspicious Heinrich Himmler, began to whisper that Rommel had lost his nerve. They pointed to his refusal to execute the commandos. They pointed to his unauthorized retreat. They argued that the People's Marshal had become too popular to control and too independent to trust. Rommel knew the vultures were circling. He began to receive visitors from Berlin official observers who were, in reality, spies for the Gestapo. They watched how he treated his men. They listened to his private conversations. In the mess tent, Rommel no longer bothered to hide his disdain for the amateurism of the Nazi leadership. He spoke openly of the need for a negotiated peace, a concept that was considered heresy. He was walking a tightrope over an abyss. By saving his army, he had saved the heart of the German military, but he had sealed his own fate. The man who had been the sword of the Third Reich was now becoming its most prominent internal target, and the shadow of the executioner's axe was beginning to stretch across the sands toward him. By early 1943, the legend of the Desert Fox was intact in the eyes of the German public, but for Erwin Rommel, the mirror had shattered. He returned to Germany, a changed man, haunted not just by the defeat at El Alamein, but by the moral rot he had witnessed at the heart of the High Command. The man who had once been Hitler's favorite general now found himself viewed with cold suspicion. The burning of the commando order and the unauthorized retreat in Africa were no longer just battlefield decisions. They were black marks in a dossier managed by the Gestapo. Rommel spent his period of forced sick leave, reflecting on the state of the Reich. He saw a nation being bled white by a leadership that refused to acknowledge reality. He saw a war that was no longer about national defense, but about a fanatical descent into oblivion. The victory or death mentality that he had defied in the desert was now being applied to the entire German people. During this time, Rommel was approached by members of the German resistance men who believed that the only way to save Germany was to remove Hitler from power. For a man of Rommel's background, the idea of a coup was an agonizing struggle. He was a soldier, and a soldier's duty was to obey. Yet, he could not forget the burned telegram. He could not forget the faces of the soldiers he had saved by breaking his oath. He began to realize that true loyalty to his country required a higher form of treason against its leader. He did not join the plotters in their plan for assassination. He still held a soldier's disdain for cold-blooded murder. While he contemplated these heavy truths, the Führer decided to use Rommel's popularity one last time. He was sent to France to oversee the Atlantic Wall, the massive system of coastal defenses intended to stop the inevitable Allied invasion. It was a position of immense responsibility, but it was also a golden cage. Rommel worked with his usual feverish energy, pouring concrete and laying millions of mines, but his heart was heavy. He knew that even if he built the strongest wall in history, it would eventually crumble under the weight of a regime that had abandoned its humanity. The fox was back in the field, but he was no longer fighting for victory. He was fighting to find a way to end the madness before everything he loved was turned to ash. In the spring of 1944, the French coast became the stage for Rommel's final tactical masterpiece, but the concrete and steel of the Atlantic Wall could not hide the growing fracture in his soul. He spent his days obsessively inspecting bunkers and beach obstacles, driving thousands of miles in his open-top Horch staff car. To his soldiers, he was still the energetic desert fox, the man who led from the front, but to his inner circle, he was a man living in two different worlds. One world was the military reality of an impending Allied invasion that he knew would be nearly impossible to stop. The other was the dark political reality of a Germany led by a man who had lost all touch with sanity. The shadow of the commando order followed him to France. On several occasions, Allied airmen and saboteurs were captured behind German lines. The pressure from the SS and the High Command to execute these terrorists was immense. Yet, Rommel's defiance remained silent and absolute. He didn't shout his disagreement. He simply ensured the orders were lost or delayed until the prisoners could be safely transferred to regular POW camps. He was playing a lethal game of hide-and-seek with the Gestapo, knowing that every life he saved was another piece of evidence that could be used to hang him. As D-Day approached, Rommel's private journals revealed a man who had reached a breaking point. He wrote of the hopelessness of the situation and his growing disdain for the amateurs in Berlin. He began to speak more openly with his fellow generals about a post-Hitler world. He wasn't looking for a promotion or power. He was looking for a way to save the German people from total annihilation. He believed that if he could hold the Allies on the beaches long enough to negotiate a peace, he might save millions of lives. But the tragedy of Erwin Rommel was that he was too honorable for the regime he served and too late to the cause of the resistance. He was a man of action, trapped in a system that demanded blind obedience. On the eve of the greatest invasion in history, Rommel found himself isolated, distrusted by the fanatics in Berlin, and yet not fully part of the conspirators who sought to end the war. He stood on the cliffs of Normandy, looking out at the gray English Channel. Knowing that the storm was coming, he had saved 400 men in a bunker and thousands in the desert, but he was beginning to realize that saving an entire nation would require a sacrifice he hadn't yet dared to imagine. July 20th, 1944. A day that would change the course of German history and seal the fate of its most famous general. While Rommel was recovering from a near-fatal strafing attack by Allied aircraft in Normandy, a bomb exploded in a remote bunker in East Prussia. The attempt on Adolf Hitler's life had failed, and the vengeful fury of the Führer was about to be unleashed. As the Gestapo began to tear the military establishment apart looking for conspirators, the name Erwin Rommel began to appear in the interrogation rooms. The tragedy of Rommel's involvement was not what he did, but what he knew. He was not a bomber. He was not a mastermind of the coup. But he had listened. He had met with the plotters. He had agreed that Germany needed a future without the madness of the current regime. Most importantly, he had remained silent. In the eyes of the Nazi court, knowing of a plot and not reporting it was just as treasonous as pulling the trigger. The man who had burned the commando order to protect his honor was now being hunted for that same sense of integrity. As Hitler's inner circle looked at the evidence, they saw a pattern of quiet rebellion going back years. They remembered the defiance at Alamein. They remembered the refusal to execute prisoners. They realized that Rommel's popularity was a shield that had allowed him to ignore the Führer's most brutal directives. But now, with the regime in its death throes, that shield was gone. Hitler felt personally betrayed by the man he had once elevated to the status of a god. The order was given. Rommel must be eliminated, but he was too beloved to be executed publicly. A show trial would turn the public against the Nazi Party. The plan was as cold as the desert night. They would offer him a choice, the same kind of impossible choice Rommel had faced throughout the war. On one side, a public trial, the arrest of his family, and a shameful death. On the other, a quiet suicide with the promise that his family would be spared and he would be given a hero's funeral. The Desert Fox was finally cornered, not by the British Eighth Army, but by the very monster he had served. As the black staff cars began their journey toward his home in Herrlingen, Rommel prepared to face his final and most painful sacrifice, proving that in a world of total tyranny, the ultimate price of honor is often life itself. October 14th, 1944, a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the village of Herrlingen. The war that Erwin Rommel had fought on distant continents was now at his front door. Two generals from Berlin, Bergdorf and Maisel, arrived in a dark Mercedes. They did not come with medals or new commands. They came with a box of cyanide and a choice that was no choice at all. Rommel met them in his study. The conversation was brief. They laid out the evidence. His name was on the lists of the conspirators. They told him that the Führer's patience had expired. Then, the ultimatum was delivered. If he agreed to die by his own hand, he would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His wife, Lucie, and his son, Manfred, would be safe. They would keep his pension. They would not be sent to the camps. But if he refused, if he insisted on a trial, the machinery of the state would crush everything he loved. Rommel understood. This was the final manifestation of the tyranny. He had served a regime that held families hostage to ensure silence. He walked upstairs to his wife's room. He told her the truth in a voice that didn't tremble. "I will be dead in a quarter of an hour," he said simply. He put on his old leather coat from the African campaign, the one stained with the salt and dust of the desert. He picked up his field marshal's baton, the symbol of his rank, his achievements, and now his sacrifice. As he walked down the driveway toward the waiting car, Rommel did not look like a man being led to his execution. He looked like a man going on one last reconnaissance mission. He took a seat in the back of the Mercedes. The car drove a few hundred yards into a nearby forest. General Maisel and the driver stepped out, leaving Rommel alone with Bergdorf. 5 minutes later, the Desert Fox was dead. The state funeral that followed was a masterpiece of Nazi hypocrisy. Swastika-draped wreaths were piled high. Hitler sent a message of condolence, praising the heroic death of his greatest general. But beneath the pageantry, the truth was already beginning to leak out. Rommel had died not for a cause, but to protect his family from the cause. He had spent his final years defying orders to murder others, and in the end, he had to follow one final order to murder himself. He had saved 400 men in a bunker, thousands more in the retreat, and countless prisoners by burning a telegram. Now, his own life was the price for their survival. The man was gone, but the mystery of his conscience remained, a silent protest against a world that had gone mad. Erwin Rommel was buried with the pomp and circumstance of a national hero, but the regime that killed him didn't realize they had created something far more durable than a propaganda icon. By choosing to die to save his family, and by choosing to live his final years according to his conscience rather than his orders, Rommel had planted a seed of doubt in the mind of the German military that would eventually help break the spell of the Third Reich. He was a man of deep contradictions, a brilliant general for a criminal cause, but in the moments that truly mattered, when the cameras weren't rolling and the medals didn't count, he chose the harder path of humanity. The commando order that he burned in the desert, the victory or death decree he defied at El Alamein, and the prisoners he protected in France were not just tactical footnotes. They were proof that even in the heart of a machine designed for total destruction, an individual still has the power to say no. Rommel's story teaches us that true strength is not found in blind obedience or the ability to crush an opponent. It is found in the restraint of power. It is found in the quiet courage of a man who looks at an unjust order and chooses to let it turn to ash in the flames of an oil lamp. Decades after the war, Rommel remains one of the few figures from the losing side who is still studied with respect by his former enemies. Not just for his maneuvers in the sand, but for the character he displayed when the walls were closing in. He was the Desert Fox, a master of deception and speed. Yet his final victory was one of absolute transparency and moral stillness. He showed that you can lose a war and still save your soul. History is often written by the victors, but the legacy of Erwin Rommel is written in the lives of the men he refused to execute and the soldiers he refused to sacrifice. His watch has stopped, and his baton is behind glass, but the lesson he left behind echoes across time. Real power is not what you do when you are winning. It is what you do when you have the power to be cruel, but you choose to be just. It is the realization that while a regime can take your life, only you can give away your honor. And in the end, that honor is the only thing that survives the fire